She waited at the airport, smiling, holding a welcome home sign, but as her husband walked toward her, she whispered just 8 words that shattered his world. "How was your business trip to Miami, Jake?" Because she knew. He never left the city. And what happened next, you won't see coming. The airport buzzed with movement. Families reunited, lovers embraced, tired travelers dragged their luggage toward the exit. Amid the chaos, Sarah stood still, holding a welcome home, Jake's sign in perfectly steady hands. She had played this role before, the loving wife greeting her husband after a long trip, smiling, waiting, eager to hear his stories about meetings, late-night flights, and the oh-so-exhausting business world he claimed to navigate. But tonight was different. Jake emerged from the crowd, rolling his suitcase behind him, a relaxed grin on his face. His usual act, the weary businessman returning home. His eyes met hers, and for a moment he hesitated. Not long, just a flicker, a moment of uncertainty, gone as fast as it appeared. Sarah felt the weight of the last few months pressing down on her chest. The late nights, the excuses, the deleted messages, the missing credit card transactions, and the moment she had confirmed it all. Jake reached her, dropping his suitcase and wrapping his arms around her in a warm, familiar embrace. The scent of his cologne, the press of his hands against her back. Things she once found comforting now made her stomach twist. She let him hold her, let him think everything was normal. Then, right next to his ear, she whispered, "So, how was your business trip in Miami?" Jake froze. She felt his body stiffen just for a second before he quickly pulled back, forcing a smile. "What?" Sarah tilted her head, smiling back. "Miami. You were in Miami, right?" Jake blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in their marriage, he was speechless. Sarah's fingers tightened around the sign, her nails pressing into the cardboard. Her pulse was calm, steady, because she already knew, and Jake had no idea what was coming next. Jake let out a short, forced laugh, shaking his head like she had just made a silly mistake. "Of course, Miami. Where else would I be?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She just watched him, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel it. The way his eyes darted, left, right, searching the crowd like someone might save him. "That's funny," she said finally, her voice smooth. "Because I checked your flight records. You never left the city." Jake blinked. Once, twice. His jaw tightened just slightly. "Sarah, come on. Where is this coming from?" He reached for his suitcase, as if moving would somehow make this conversation disappear. "Let's just go home." Sarah didn't move. "Home?" she repeated, tilting her head. "You mean the place where I waited for you while you were supposedly in meetings? The place where I tracked your car when it stayed parked at the same hotel for 2 weeks?" Jake inhaled sharply through his nose. She saw it then, the briefest shift in his expression, annoyance, not fear, not guilt, just irritation. "Sarah," he started again, this time firmer. "This isn't the time or place." Sarah smiled. "Oh, I think it's the perfect place." Jake's jaw clenched, his fingers curling around the handle of his suitcase a little too tightly. Around them, people walked by, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing between them. "So, Jake," she continued, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear, "are you going to tell me where you really were, or should I ask her?" That's when Jake's face changed. Not just irritation now, panic. Jake's grip on his suitcase tightened, his knuckles paling, his jaw twitched, just for a second, before he forced a dry chuckle. "Her? Who's her, Sarah?" His voice was careful now, like he was testing the ground beneath him, trying to find solid footing. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a flick of her thumb, the screen lit up. "This her," she said simply, turning it toward him. Jake's face remained blank, but his eyes, those always gave him away. His gaze flickered down just for a second, taking in the photo. Him, seated at a dimly lit bar, leaning too close to a woman with sleek blonde hair, her hand resting on his knee. Sarah watched his reaction closely, savoring that heartbeat of silence where his brain scrambled for a way out. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing around. His voice lowered, controlled. "You're making a scene." Sarah let out a small laugh, stepping closer, just enough that he could hear her words clearly over the airport chatter. "No, Jake," she murmured. "I'm making a point." His nostrils flared slightly. "I can explain." Sarah arched an eyebrow. "Then do it." Another pause. Another flicker of his eyes, calculating, adjusting, rewriting the story in real time. "She's a client," Sarah smirked, crossing her arms. "A client who books hotel rooms under your name, because I have those receipts too." Jake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. The irritation was still there, but now something else crept in too. Desperation. Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his usual confidence beginning to crack. He glanced around the airport, his eyes scanning for an escape, any escape. But there wasn't one, not this time. Sarah kept her stance firm, her expression calm, controlled. She had spent months waiting for this moment. "Go ahead, Jake," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Explain. Tell me how this is all just a misunderstanding, how I'm the crazy, paranoid wife jumping to conclusions." Jake let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sarah, I swear." "Swear what?" She cut him off, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "That you've been honest? That those business trips weren't just an excuse to run around behind my back?" She took a step closer, lowering her phone but keeping her eyes locked on his. "Because I've been keeping track, Jake. Every lie, every detail. You didn't go to Miami. You didn't go anywhere. But your car, your credit cards, they tell a different story." Jake's fingers twitched at his side, his breathing heavier now. She could see the gears turning in his head, trying to come up with something, anything, that might still get him out of this. But Sarah wasn't finished. "2 weeks ago," she continued, her tone even, measured, "you told me you had a meeting with investors. You even called me from the airport. Let me hear the intercom announcements in the background. But funny thing about that." She pulled another piece of paper from her bag and unfolded it slowly. "No record of your flight, no boarding pass, no hotel reservations in Miami under your name. In fact, you were right here, 5 kilometers from our house, checking into a hotel with her." Jake clenched his jaw. "Sarah, please, can we—" She cut him off again. "Can we what, Jake? Take this home? Talk about it in private?" Her voice turned icy. "That's what you're really mad about, isn't it? That I'm doing this here in public? That I'm not giving you time to come up with another lie?" She could see the panic rising in his eyes, the way his breathing had changed. For years, he had been in control of the narrative, always a step ahead, always knowing exactly what to say to smooth things over, but not anymore. Sarah let the silence stretch between them, letting him feel it. The weight of the truth crashing down on him, tightening around his throat like a noose. Then finally, she spoke again. "So tell me, Jake, who is she?" Jake's mouth opened, then closed. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. And for the first time since they met, he had nothing to say. Jake's silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The sounds of the airport faded into the background, the rolling suitcases, the boarding announcements, the murmured conversations of passing travelers. None of it mattered. Not here. Not now. Sarah held his gaze, unblinking, waiting. She wasn't going to repeat herself. She wasn't going to let him dodge this. Jake finally exhaled, slow and controlled, like he was trying to steady himself. "Sarah," he started, voice lower now, careful. "You need to listen to me." Sarah let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, that's rich. Now you want me to listen? After months of ignoring my gut? After you stood in our home and lied to my face over and over again?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "No, Jake. It's your turn to listen." His jaw clenched. He was cornered, and he knew it. His usual tricks, deflection, fake frustration, turning the blame onto her, weren't working. Not this time. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out another slip of paper, unfolding it slowly, deliberately. She held it up between them. "This is a hotel invoice," she said. "Room 214, 2 weeks straight. Paid with our joint credit card." Jake inhaled sharply through his nose. His lips parted slightly as if he was about to say something, but Sarah cut him off. "No need to lie, Jake. I already checked." She let that sink in before continuing. "The staff at the front desk? They know you, recognize you, said you were a regular guest. But here's the best part." She leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to a deadly calm. "When I asked them if you were ever alone, they laughed." A flicker of something crossed Jake's face. Guilt, panic, or maybe just sheer frustration that he had been caught so thoroughly. He looked away for the first time, shifting his weight, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Sarah." "Don't." She held up a hand. "Don't waste my time with another lie." Jake's fingers curled into fists, his breathing coming harder now. He was unraveling. The smooth-talking, always-in-control businessman was crumbling under the weight of his own deception. Sarah tilted her head, studying him like a stranger. "I'm asking you one last time, Jake." Her voice was quiet, steady, lethal. "Who is she?" Jake swallowed hard, his shoulders tensed, and then, just when she thought he might finally crack, he laughed. Not loud, not long, just a short, bitter sound. A sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You really want the truth?" he murmured, finally meeting her eyes. Sarah's heart pounded. Her fingers tightened around the papers in her hand. Jake smirked. "All right then." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Here it is." And with that, he finally said the name. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The world tilted, and suddenly she realized she wasn't just dealing with an affair, she was dealing with something worse. Jake's smirk faded just as quickly as it had appeared, but the damage was done. The name hung in the air between them, thick, heavy, suffocating. Sarah felt her stomach lurch. Her fingers dug into the hotel invoice, crumpling the paper slightly. She had been prepared for anything, an affair, deception, betrayal. But this? Her throat tightened, the weight of realization crashing down on her. "No." She shook her head, as if rejecting it would make it untrue. "Tell me you're lying." Jake let out a slow breath. "You asked for the truth." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. Her vision tunneled for a moment, the world blurring at the edges. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to stay standing. "It's not what you think," Jake added quickly, stepping toward her, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. Sarah let out a hollow laugh, stepping back. "Oh, I promise you, Jake, it's exactly what I think." Her mind reeled, connecting dots she had ignored before. The last-minute cancellations, the knowing glances, the half-truths woven together so seamlessly. She should have seen this coming. She should have known. Her grip tightened around her phone, the screen still glowing with the evidence. "You cheated on me with her." The words tasted bitter on her tongue. Jake's jaw tensed, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't supposed to happen." Sarah's hands trembled, rage boiling beneath her skin. Oh, that's comforting. That makes it so much better. She let out a sharp breath, voice thick with anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jake rubbed his temples like this was his problem to deal with, like he was the victim. Sarah, listen. Don't. Her voice was cold now. You don't get to Sarah. Listen me. You don't get to stand here in front of everyone and pretend this is fixable. Jake's mouth pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, and in that silence, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The hurt, the confusion, the betrayal. It was all still there, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something dangerous. She had spent months questioning herself, doubting her instincts, waiting for the truth to come to light. But now it was her turn to act, her turn to make Jake pay. Sarah's breath came fast and uneven, but her mind was sharper than ever. The shock had settled, replaced by something colder, something stronger. She had wasted so much time waiting for Jake to slip up, waiting for proof, for confirmation, for him to give her something undeniable. And now, standing here in the middle of the airport, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were witnessing a marriage unravel in real time, she realized something. She wasn't just here to confront him. She was here to end this. Jake shifted, running a hand through his hair, a nervous tick she had seen 100 times before. Look, Sarah, I get that you're upset. Sarah's laugh was sharp, biting. Oh, you get it now? You finally understand why I might be a little pissed off. Jake exhaled, glancing around again, his discomfort growing. Can we not do this here? His voice was lower now, his frustration creeping through. Sarah took a step forward, closing the space between them. Why not, Jake? You didn't seem to mind lying to me in public. Why should I mind tearing your world apart in the same way? She could see it now, the panic in his eyes. He wasn't just worried about her anymore. He was worried about everyone else. The people passing by, the airport staff, the families reuniting just a few feet away. This wasn't just a fight between a husband and wife. This was an exposure. Jake swallowed hard. Sarah, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. She arched an eyebrow, tilting her head. Oh? So you didn't just admit to sleeping with... She stopped herself, taking a slow breath. You know what? Say it. Say her name again. Jake tensed. What? Sarah's voice was quiet, dangerous. Say her name. He hesitated. She knew he wouldn't. He couldn't. Saying it once had already been a mistake. Saying it again meant owning it, confirming it. Jake shook his head. Sarah, let's just go home and talk. Sarah smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Oh, Jake. She reached into her bag and pulled out one last envelope, holding it up between them. We're not going home. Jake stared at the envelope like it was a bomb waiting to go off. And in a way it was, because inside that envelope was his real nightmare, not just the proof of his affair, but the consequences. Jake didn't move. He didn't reach for the envelope. He just stared at it, his breathing shallow, his entire body tense. Sarah could almost hear the thoughts racing through his head. What does she know? How much does she have? She didn't make him wait long. Go on, Jake. Open it. His fingers twitched, but he didn't take it. Sarah sighed, shaking her head. Fine, I'll do it for you. She tore open the flap with one sharp motion, pulling out a stack of neatly printed papers. Jake's jaw clenched. Sarah. She ignored him, flipping through the first page. Let's start with the bank statements. I went over our finances last week. Funny thing, Jake, you had a lot of withdrawals, large ones, unexplained ones, and they all lead back to the same account. Jake took a step forward, lowering his voice. Sarah, stop. Sarah smiled, but it was ice cold. No, Let's keep going, because you weren't just lying about where you were. She flicked to the next paper, holding it up between them. You were stealing from me. Jake exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring. That's not true. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Oh, come on, Jake. If you're going to lie, at least put some effort into it. She held up the statement, tapping a highlighted transaction. 2 weeks ago, 5,000 transferred to an account in her name. Should I keep going? Jake's hands curled into fists. This isn't what you think. Sarah took another step closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. It never is it? But tell me something, Jake. What exactly was the plan? Were you going to take everything and disappear? Run off with her and leave me with nothing? Jake opened his mouth, closed it. He looked away, and that was all the confirmation she needed. Sarah exhaled, steadying herself. You really thought I wouldn't find out? Jake's jaw was tight, his face unreadable now. I was going to fix it, Sarah scoffed. Fix it? Oh, that's rich. You weren't going to fix anything. You were going to drain our accounts and walk away like none of this ever happened. She leaned in, her voice razor sharp. But here's the thing, Jake. I got to it first. His head snapped up. What? Sarah smirked, pulling out another sheet of paper, the final nail in his coffin. I froze the accounts. Jake's face drained of color. Sarah tilted her head, watching him like a predator sizing up its prey. You don't have access to a single cent anymore. Jake's breathing was uneven now, his panic no longer hidden. You... Sarah cut him off with a single word. Check. Jake dug into his pocket, fumbling for his phone. His fingers moved quickly, his face pale as he navigated to his banking app. Sarah just stood there, watching. Then, the moment she had been waiting for, Jake's entire body went still. She saw it in his eyes. The exact second he realized she wasn't bluffing. He was locked out. Every account, every card, every bit of stolen money. Gone. Sarah folded her arms, exhaling in mock sympathy. That's gotta hurt. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he lowered his phone. For the first time, he truly looked afraid. Good, because she was just getting started. Jake's breathing was uneven now, his entire posture stiff, his fingers gripping his useless phone like he could somehow will his accounts back open. His usual confidence, that smug arrogance he always carried, was gone. Sarah took a deep breath, steady and controlled, feeling the shift in power. For the first time in months, she wasn't the one searching for answers. She had them all, and Jake had nothing. This is insane, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head, still staring at his phone screen. You had no right. Sarah scoffed, cutting him off. No right. That's interesting coming from you, Jake. Because let's recap, shall we? She started ticking off on her fingers, her voice dripping with mock patience. You lied to me, stole from me, took our money and handed it over to her. Oh, and you planned to disappear with it. But I'm the one crossing the line. Jake's nostrils flared, his fingers clenching into fists. I wasn't going to disappear. Sarah arched an eyebrow. No? She pulled out her phone again, tapping on the screen before turning it toward him. Then why did you have these booked? Jake's eyes flicked down, and for a split second, Sarah saw it. The exact moment he knew he was done. Displayed on her screen were 2 one-way plane tickets. His name, her name, a flight scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jake's jaw locked. His body was rigid, as if standing still would somehow make the evidence disappear. Sarah let out a slow breath, shaking her head. Wow, Jake. Not even a round trip. Just straight to the next life without me. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, but still, he said nothing. No excuses, no clever cover-ups, just silence. Sarah studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You weren't just leaving me. You were leaving everything, the house, our life, our marriage, and you weren't even going to tell me. Jake's gaze darted around the airport like he could somehow escape this conversation, but Sarah wasn't letting him off the hook. She took a step closer, her voice quieter now, but far more dangerous. Who were you going to be, Jake? Some new man in some new city? A fresh start with her, paid for with my money? Jake let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. It's not like that. Sarah tilted her head. Then tell me what it is like, because from where I'm standing, you're nothing but a lying, selfish, gutless coward. Jake flinched, but she didn't stop. She didn't want to stop. You didn't even have the decency to end it before you ran. You were going to let me wake up one morning, check the bank, and realize you were gone. She let out a short, bitter laugh. And you would have let me believe something terrible happened to you, wouldn't you? Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. That had been the plan. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened, her nails digging into the case. I thought I knew you, Jake. I really did, but I was wrong. Jake finally lifted his gaze to hers. His lips parted, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might actually say something real, but then he smirked. Sarah felt her stomach turn. That smirk, that same smug, arrogant expression he had used every time he thought he was a step ahead. You froze my accounts, he said, his voice lower now, measured. But you didn't get everything. Sarah's blood ran cold. Jake slipped his phone back into his pocket, his confidence creeping back. You think you won, Sarah? He let out a small chuckle. You're cute. Sarah's fingers twitched at her side. What are you talking about? Jake leaned in just slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not the only one who planned ahead. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Because suddenly, for the first time since this entire confrontation began, she wasn't sure who had the upper hand anymore. Sarah felt the shift instantly. The air between them changed, again. She had spent this entire confrontation tearing him down, peeling back his lies layer by layer, exposing every rotten part of the life he had built on deception. But now he was smiling. That smirk, that goddamn smirk. Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her expression still. She refused to let him see even an ounce of hesitation. What do you mean, Jake? Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head like she was the foolish one. Oh, Sarah, you think I didn't see this coming? His voice was smooth now, too controlled. You think I didn't know you'd go digging? Sarah's grip on her phone tightened. You're bluffing. Jake tilted his head. Am I? Something about his tone sent a chill down her spine. Sarah had been so sure she had beaten him, that she had taken everything before he could make his move. But Jake wasn't panicking anymore. He wasn't stuttering or scrambling. He was calm, and that scared her more than anything. I moved the money before you even got close, Jake said simply, slipping his hands into his pockets like he had all the time in the world. You froze the wrong accounts. Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew Jake. She knew how calculated he could be, how he played the long game. And suddenly she realized she might not have been the only one keeping secrets. Her mind raced. How? When? Where had he put it? Jake leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice. You thought you had me backed into a corner, that I was completely screwed. His eyes darkened. But the thing is, Sarah, I was always one step ahead. Sarah inhaled slowly, keeping her hands steady even though her entire body wanted to shake. If that's true, she murmured, why are you still here? Jake blinked, caught off guard by the question. Sarah took a slow step forward, tilting her head. If you really had it all planned out, why are you standing here wasting time arguing with me? For the briefest second, one tiny moment, She saw it. Doubt. A flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And that's when Sarah knew. He wasn't as confident as he wanted her to believe. She smiled. It was small, controlled, but it was there. "You didn't move it fast enough, did you?" Jake's expression hardened, his jaw locking. Sarah let out a soft chuckle, stepping even closer. "You're scared, Jake." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Because you don't know how much I already found." Jake didn't answer. Sarah's pulse was steady now. She had him again, and this time she wasn't going to let him get away. Jake's smirk had faded, but Sarah could see the battle still raging behind his eyes. He was calculating, measuring his next move, trying to decide if he should double down on his confidence or start searching for a way out. Sarah didn't give him that chance. "Tell me, Jake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "How many accounts did you set up? 2, 3, offshore, under a fake name?" Jake's fingers twitched at his sides. He was holding himself together, but barely. Sarah took another step, closing the space between them. "Did you think I wouldn't look there too?" Jake swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You don't know what you're talking about." Sarah let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Don't I?" She reached into her bag again and pulled out one last paper, a printed bank statement, not from one of their shared accounts, not from the frozen ones, but from his private account, the one he had tried to hide. Jake's breath hitched just slightly, so small most people wouldn't notice. But Sarah wasn't most people. She held it up between them, tapping her finger against a highlighted transaction. This one, 50,000, moved 2 days ago into another account. She smiled, tilting her head. "That was smart, Jake. Really, you almost got away with it." Jake's lips parted slightly, and Sarah could see the realization dawning on him. She knew. She had him. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "But the thing is, sweetheart, banks don't just erase records." Jake's jaw clenched. "You can't touch that money." Sarah let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, Jake, I don't need to." Jake narrowed his eyes. "What the hell does that mean?" Sarah leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means I wasn't the only one who saw these statements." Jake's face paled. Sarah let the silence stretch between them, letting him sit in his own downfall. Then, finally, she gave him the final blow. "You're under investigation." Jake froze. "Your employer got a copy." Sarah's voice was smooth, steady. "So did the authorities." Jake's breathing was heavy now, his fingers curling into fists. You wouldn't." Sarah arched an eyebrow. "Wouldn't I?" She took a step back, slipping the papers neatly back into her bag, then dusted off her hands like she had just wrapped up a casual errand. "So, Jake," she sighed, shrugging, "that whole new life you were planning, that's going to look a little different now." Jake's face twisted, his mouth opening, but nothing came out. For the first time, he had no moves left. And Sarah? Sarah was already walking away. Jake stood frozen, his face shifting through every stage of realization. Denial, anger, desperation. His fingers flexed at his sides, his jaw locked so tight it looked like he might crack a tooth. Sarah didn't stop walking. She didn't need to. She had already won. Behind her, she heard Jake's breath hitch, followed by the hurried shuffle of his footsteps as he caught up. "Sarah, wait." His voice was hoarse now, stripped of the arrogance he had clung to for so long. Sarah stopped, but didn't turn. She let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel the full weight of it. Then, slowly, she turned her head over her shoulder. "For what?" Jake swallowed hard. His entire demeanor had changed. He wasn't the smug businessman anymore, wasn't the smooth liar who had spent years perfecting his deception. He was a man who had just lost everything. "We can fix this," he said quickly, like if he said it fast enough she might actually believe him. We can figure it out. Sarah tilted her head. Fix what, Jake? Her voice was almost amused. Your affair, the money you stole, or the fact that the company you built your whole identity around is about to find out what kind of man you really are. Jake's mouth opened, but Sarah didn't let him speak. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. I was never going to stop you, Jake. She smiled, but it was sharp, cutting. I was going to let you go. Let you run off and disappear into whatever life you thought you could buy. She exhaled, shaking her head. But you got greedy. Jake's eyes flickered. You stole from me. Sarah's voice didn't waver, didn't shake, didn't hold a single ounce of doubt. And that's where you messed up. Jake exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he still thought he could talk his way out of it. Sarah, please, just no. That single word hit harder than anything else she had said all night. Jake flinched. Sarah let the moment hang, let him feel what it was like to be shut out. Then, with one last slow breath, she straightened her shoulders. Goodbye, Jake. And then she turned and walked away. No more questions, no more explanations, no more chances. Behind her, she could hear Jake's breathing pick up, could feel the way the air shifted, how he was scrambling to grab onto something, anything, to stop the fall. But there was nothing left to hold on to. She was done. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Sarah didn't look back. She walked through the airport doors, past the crowds, past the families hugging, past the couples laughing. Their lives moved forward, untouched, while hers unraveled in front of them. And yet, she felt lighter than she had in years. Behind her, she could still hear Jake's footsteps. Faster now, desperate. He wasn't done. Sarah, stop. She didn't. You can't just walk away from this. Sarah let out a breath, shaking her head. Watch me. The doors slid open, the cold air hitting her skin like a fresh start. She stepped outside, her heels clicking against the pavement, the night wrapping around her like an old friend. Jake followed, grabbing her wrist just before she reached the curb. We can fix this, he said, his voice tight, shaking. Please. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There it was, fear, real, raw, consuming. He knew what was coming. Jake, she said softly, shaking her head. It's over. His grip loosened. The accounts are locked. The company knows. And in a few days, so will everyone else. She exhaled, tilting her head. You thought you were running away, but really, you were running straight into a disaster. Jake swallowed hard. His mouth opened, searching for words, searching for something, anything, to stop this. But there was nothing left to say. A car pulled up, Sarah's ride. She reached for the handle, then paused, turning back one last time. Good luck, Jake. Then she got in. The door shut, the car pulled away, and just like that, she left him behind.